We have enhanced the role of a very elite group of wealthy donors and their influence in the political process. That we have exacerbated the problem of undisclosed money in our elections, and that we see more and more of it flowing into elections these days. And that we've given rise, as Jim notes, to an array of so-called independent groups that take many forms that, for the most part, are now allowed to freely raise and spend money to support the candidates that are their preference. And in my view, one of the results of this is that we have significantly increased the influence of a very small elite of individuals in this country. And we have undermined the accountability and transparency of the system.
Congress shall make no law. Think of those words. Let's say they really wanted to prevent Congress from making no law. What would they have said? Congress shall really not make any laws. What would they have said? Other than Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and of the press.
SpeechNow.org was a political committee, and they wanted to make independent expenditures. In fact, they specifically said, we only want to make independent expenditures in campaigns. We have no intention whatsoever of making contributions to candidates. And consequently, they challenged the constitutionality of the contribution limits that they had to operate under and the disclosure rules that they were required to abide by as a political committee. Up to this point, any group of individuals acting as a political committee could make unlimited independent expenditures. As Jim would tell you, that was a basic assumption made in the Buckley case in 1976, that the court basically took the doctrinal assumption that money spent independently does not pose a risk of corruption because there's no direct exchange with a candidate, and therefore independent expenditures should not be limited in their amounts. But the court did note that the amounts of money raised had to come from limited contributions, and that had been the law until we got to Speech Now. These groups could spend all the money they want as long as they raised it from individuals in amounts of $5,000 a year or less, $5,000 per year. And no one could come up with a good acronym, so they started calling them super PACs. Okay? These are political committees that, as you now know, can raise unlimited amounts from any permissible source and spend unlimited amounts. The general assumption of the court was that these would be wholly independent of the candidates, that these would be independent activities. But the lines quickly began to blur. You soon saw the rise of super PACs that were established not only by independent groups, but by party operatives, former party staff, former campaign staff, former political staff of members of Congress, including two super PACs set up by former staff and political associates of the House and Senate Democratic leadership who thought that they would get in on this. By 2011, these so-called independent committees had quickly given rise to the single candidate super PAC, a super PAC set up only for one candidate to support a candidate in one specific election, and thus basically operate as a parallel campaign organization.
Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the right of the people to assemble and to petition their government. There are four indispensable freedoms in that amendment. There's actually two parts, one protecting religion, the other protecting what the court has called the four indispensable democratic freedoms that are necessary for the people to be able to participate in their own government. Because at the founding of our country, really for the first time in the history of the world, we had a different idea about how the government was to be organized. All the other governments were organized top-down. The government was to tell the people, you know, what freedoms they would have or regulate them as they choose. sometimes for the good of the people, sometimes just to loot them for the benefit of the elites, more often the second, to loot them. But our concept was bottom up. That is, that we were engaged in self-government and that we were to elect representatives of us to then temporarily hold limited government power for, the advancement of the common good. It's a completely different concept. That made the First Amendment the most radical campaign finance law in the history of the world.
The actions were facilitated by the Federal Election Commission, which essentially is the agency responsible for regulating federal campaign finance law, who basically ruled that these committees need not be wholly independent of the candidates. In fact, the FEC said that candidates could attend super PAC events. Candidates could be the featured guest at a super PAC event or fundraiser. Candidates could speak at super PAC events. They could engage in other interactions with super PACs and their donors. The one thing they couldn't do is ask for the money. They could ask for a contribution, but it had to be in conformity with contribution limits. But as you know, at any fundraiser, the candidate typically isn't the one asking for the money. That's why we made staff. They ask for the money, and the candidate comes and appears, takes photos with everyone, meets and greets, and moves on. So essentially, these PACs now operate fundraisers essentially like all other campaign fundraisers. So they're not wholly independent. What's more, the premise of the Speech Now case was that the committee specifically said we have no intention to make contributions to candidates, so we're not going to be involved directly with the candidates. But that proviso also went out the window. The Federal Election Commission agreed in response to some litigation that a super PAC could be just like a traditional PAC and make contributions to candidates as long as they had a separate bank account and raised regulated contributions for that bank account. They could be both. They could be kind of a traditional PAC and make contributions to candidates, and be a super PAC and take unlimited money to spend on independent expenditures, which gave rise to what I like to call the hybrid PAC, right? Or conversely, a traditional PAC could now just set up a bank account for its independent expenditures, take unlimited money from any permissible source, and make the independent expenditures out of that pool of money. Many of these super PACs decided to start to align themselves with tax-exempt organizations, what are known in tax law as 501c4 organizations, basically public policy advocacy organizations or other organizations that are offering one major advantage. They are not required to fully disclose their funds or receipts and expenditures under the law. They're only required to report monies that they spend on something like an independent expenditure expressly supporting a candidate or an election communication, a broadcast advertisement featuring a candidate close to an election. But they are required to report what they spend on those items. In particular, the law says that if you make an electioneering communication and you spend $10,000 in a calendar year, you're required to disclose the amounts of money you spent on these items, and you're responsible for reporting each donor who gave $1,000 or more.
So they're out there multiplying organizations like jackrabbits and raising unlimited sums into these organizations. And do any of you actually think you're going to ever know anything about this? No. No transparency, because it's just too complicated. Too many rabbit holes. You'll never know. And you won't know who either. Now that all assumes if you care. Frankly, few people care. But if you cared, will you ever know? No, because some of them don't report at all. Some of them report only partially. Some report a lot. But you also have to know which one. Which is everybody that knows the super PAC that is supporting Rick Perry, who was here this weekend. knows the name of it? Raise your hand. Nobody. I don't know it. And I'm helping a candidate for president. I don't know the name of it. So, you know, no transparency. And how about accountability? Can you vote against a super PAC? No. Can you vote against the 527? Can you vote against the C4? No. Can you vote against a leadership PAC? Yeah, it's getting a little closer because the candidate's involved in that. So the candidate could be, you know, you could say he's responsible. Well, but you know for sure that he's responsible for his own campaign committee. So where's the accountability? It's out the window.
Most of this money comes from a small group of wealthy individuals. For the most part, the money we see come from individuals who are willing to give large amounts for political purposes. If you look since 2010, my last estimate is that there's been somewhere in the area of $1 billion in super PAC funding. 195 individuals and their spouses are responsible for most of that money. They're responsible for about 60% of it, or a little over $600 million. Or if you want another way to think about this, in 2014, the top 100 donors reporting political spending and contributions gave a total of $356 million. $323 million, which was almost as much as the $356 million raised in the entire federal election system through contributions of $200 or less. And there were 4.75 million small contributions of $200 or less, and that's what it took to match just the top 100 donors. And that doesn't include all the money that's not reported. That doesn't include the funding that's not disclosed. So, you know, what you're looking at is, you know, a system where the top of the pyramid has gained extraordinarily outsized influence. And much of this also is hidden from public view. Because of these changes in the rules that the Federal Election Commission has made, and because of the unwillingness of federal regulators largely to, you know, tighten the disclosure rules as we have gone along, what we see now is more of the money that is reported as election spending is not disclosed as far as where the money came from.
An unresponsive, unaccountable, non-transparent system. That's what it's given us. You can't hold a candidate into account because he's supported by the special interest you hate because he didn't get the money. So you can just go away around and talk to each other and say, well, you know, the money went over to that C4 over there, you know. You know, people's eyes glaze over, and you know, it doesn't mean anything to anybody, except for doing very few people that are, you know, intimately involved in all this. And they don't understand what that means. So this is the reality of our current system. And of course, the campaign finance reformers spend all of their time trying to, you know, playing knock-a-mole. You know, the mole pops up in here, and you knock it down, and then big go up, the mole comes here, and you knock it down. And, you know, one of my jobs is creating these mole holes, and it's, you know, it's not that hard, honestly. All the mole holes that could be created haven't yet been created, but I've already thought of them. And they will be created. I flat guarantee you, if there are restrictions on even the ones we have now, and we may have to have more just because the money that's required to run. So welcome to the world of campaign finance reform. Unresponsive, unaccountable, untransparent. You want to follow the money? Forget it. Forget it. Well, so there is a solution, and the solution is freedom.
You know, part of the issue with public funding was, number one, the original model was designed to say, you know, let's provide, you know, some sort of public subsidy to candidates to try to make it easier for people to run. And in doing so, many embraced public funding because after the Buckley decision, the Supreme Court said, well, the only way you're allowed to limit expenditures is if you have public funding. So they saw it more as a vehicle for limiting expenditures. I tend to support more models of public funding that are designed to expand citizen participation, get more people in the game, try to generate more small contributions. So that, you know, I have been an advocate of approaches like the New York City system or the system they're now using in Los Angeles, or a system now that they're looking at in a couple of other cities where you provide some sort of a multiple match on small contributions to give donors more of an incentive to give a small contribution and therefore provide candidates with funding that way. I think that, you know, the evidence is pretty compelling out of New York City that this type of approach has expanded the types of candidates who run. It's had a remarkable effect in increasing the demographics of the people who give. And it has helped to provide candidates with the option of running, particularly for those such as women candidates, candidates from minority communities who don't have access to wealthy donors, so that models that kind of are based on civic participation is one of the things I think are worth exploring, and we're seeing some pretty good experiments with that now.
Would you like to comment on that, Jim?
Well, you know, we have a public funding system right now, and that's for people running for president. But, you know, the last person that took it was McCain, and he had 2 months to spend it, and it was, you know, $84 million. And since there's no fundraising costs, that was probably worth, you know, maybe 120 or 30 million. If you had to raise it, you'd have to. That would be your budget. And of course, nobody in their right mind that is taking public funding now or will, either for the primary or for the general. And that is because of the fatal flaw that you, Tony, I think mentioned, is that the people who, the primary motivation, it seems, because it's not me, but it just seems from what they propose, is to limit spending. And, you know, in other words, the government is not going to give you enough. And what that means is people, while some may, like marginal candidates, non-viable candidates, things like that, people like Lyndon LaRouche, who kept running for president, even though he was in jail, he's getting public money and for running for president. But it's just not viable because you don't get enough, so the candidates that are really competitive and a viable candidate just won't participate. Yeah. And they'd be absolutely insane to participate.
Well, Jim likes to say, you know, Congress should make no law. The reality is that for a long time, you know, the courts, I mean, in the modern era, even with Buckley, has recognized very clearly that the First Amendment is not an absolute right. That freedom to political speech is also balanced with legitimate concerns the government has about corruption or the appearance of corruption. And I think that this is not a new idea. I mean, if you go back and you look at even, you know, the beginnings of our campaign finance laws, if you look at the original efforts at the beginning of the 20th century under the progressives to prohibit corporate contributions to candidates, if you look at the efforts in the late 19th century to stop assessments on individuals from part of their pay as a contribution to the party in exchange for jobs, this concern about the corrupting effect of money and the influence it may have on the system is a long-held concern that we have in our country. And one of the things that concerns me most is that what you have now is a system where we have gone from not just a member of Congress worrying about, well, if I cast this vote, am I going to lose a $5,000 contribution from this PAC, or might this be the case where I'll lose $10,000 in the next election cycle? But, you know, that's worth it to me because this is an important issue for my constituency, is that, you know, you now have members who have to think about Not simply is this going to lead to the loss of a $5,000 contribution, but is this going to lead to, you know, a $1 million campaign against me? And I think that that is a very different type of pressure and dynamic on the legislative process. And I think that if you have conversations with members of Congress, they tell you this is something they now worry about. So that one of the things you have to do is think about, you know, what the ramifications are in terms of the election. It also means that this works both ways. I think one of the problems that we have when we talk about this and we talk about the influence of money is that people too commonly see this as people trying to buy influence. And I think that's a legitimate concern. In fact, the only time I was involved in the Supreme Court case that won was in the McConnell case, where we were arguing that you should ban unlimited contributions to parties, and you should support McCain-Feingold because large contributions buy access and they buy undue influence that may not reach the standard of bribery or corruption, but is a legitimate part of corruption. And in that regard, you know, one of the things that's been going on in the last 5 years, particularly, is that we have shrunk the notion of what constitutes corruption.
Our position is not money is speech. What our position is that if you regulate money that is spent on speech, you're regulating speech. And there was a very simple explanation of that in the Buckley decision in '76 in a footnote. And it said that we have a right to travel. If you limited how much money you could spend on gas, well, then you'd be limiting travel, right? Because you got to have gas to run your car to travel. So if you're limiting how much money you can spend on gas, you're limiting the travel you can do. The same if speech takes money to go beyond the person you can reach with your own voice. And somebody had to buy the soapbox, somebody bought the megaphone, and somebody has to pay for the ad, and all takes money. If you limit what you can spend on speech, you're limiting speech, that's all. So it's a very logical.
The act of making a contribution is an act of political speech because it tells you here's the candidate you support. And whether you give $10 or $100,000 doesn't give you any more information about that speech, and therefore they said that's why we can regulate campaign contributions, that the speech value of the contribution is different than when you have someone personally spending their own money independently, because then it's their speech. But in terms of giving money to a candidate, the candidate then decides what to do with that, and therefore the court said, given the interest in safeguarding the system against corruption, that we can place more stringent requirements on campaign contributions. So I think that, you know, even if you take this conception of money and its relation to speech, it shows why campaign contributions are something that we can do in a democracy, and I think it's something that's an important safeguard in this democracy that we have lost in recent years and need to find some way to restore.
I'm very cynical about the government, and that's why I would never, ever allow them to have the power to regulate my speech, because I don't trust them. And that's what just boggles my mind. People are so critical, as you have been, of the government and not trusting them and believing that they are handmaidens to corporations, but you are simultaneously prepared to give your freedoms to the government to regulate.